This woman defeated European armies for 40 years. She outsmarted every general they sent. She led troops into battle at an age when most people can barely walk, and history tried to erase her. Her name was Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. And this is the story they didn't want you to hear. The year is 1583, West Central Africa, the kingdom of Ndongo in what is now modern-day Angola. Life here is rich, complex, advanced. The Ndongo people forge iron. They trade across vast networks. They build kingdoms that rival anything in Europe. But then the ships arrive. Portuguese ships, cutting through the Atlantic waves like knives. And they're not here to trade as equals. They're here to take land, resources, gold. But most of all, people. Human beings who can be captured, chained, and sold into slavery across the ocean. The kingdom of Ndongo stands in their way. A powerful nation, proud warriors, fierce independence. But the Portuguese have guns, cannons, warships, and an empire behind them that stretches across the globe. The odds are impossible. The invasion seems unstoppable, and into this world, a girl is born. Her name is Nzinga, and from the moment she takes her first breath, something is different. The umbilical cord is wrapped around her neck, twisted, choking. The midwives panic. They work frantically to unwrap it. The baby survives, and the elders whisper. In their language, the word for this twisted cord is Nzinga. It means wrapped, bound, strangled. They say it's an omen. This child will survive what others cannot. She will choke the life out of her enemies. They have no idea how right they are. Nzinga grows up in a kingdom at war. Her father, King Kiluwanji, fights the Portuguese every single day. Battles rage, villages burn, people disappear into slave ships, never to return. But Nzinga doesn't hide. She doesn't stay in the palace, weaving cloth or learning courtly manners. She trains with the warriors. Her father sees something in her, a fire, a sharpness, a mind that thinks 3 steps ahead. So he does something almost unheard of. He lets her learn the art of war. She learns to ride, to fight with a sword, to throw a spear with deadly accuracy, to move through the forest like a shadow. She studies strategy, how to read the land, how to predict enemy movements, how to turn weakness into advantage. And she learns something crucial about the Portuguese. They're not invincible. They're arrogant. They underestimate everyone who doesn't look like them. That will cost them dearly. In 1617, King Kiluwanji dies. Nzinga's brother, Ngola Mbandi, takes the throne, and everything falls apart. Mbandi is paranoid, cruel, weak. He sees threats everywhere, and his greatest fear is Nzinga. She's too smart, too popular, too dangerous. So he does the unthinkable. He orders her son killed, then her nephew, then anyone close to her. He tries to eliminate anyone who might support her claim to power. Nzinga is forced to flee into exile. She watches from the shadows as her brother drives the kingdom into the ground. The Portuguese smell blood in the water. They push harder. They demand tribute. They raid villages. They take more slaves. Mbandi panics. He's losing control. The kingdom is crumbling. And in 1622, he makes a desperate decision. He needs someone to negotiate with the Portuguese governor. Someone intelligent. Someone who won't be intimidated. He sends Nzinga. He thinks it's a suicide mission, a way to get rid of her without getting his hands dirty. But Mbandi doesn't understand something fundamental about his sister. Nzinga doesn't lose. 1622, the Portuguese governor's palace in Luanda. Governor João Correia de Sousa sits on an elevated throne, gold trim, velvet cushions, a symbol of power designed to make visitors feel small. Nzinga enters. She's dressed in full royal regalia, gold jewelry, intricate fabrics, a crown. She walks with the confidence of someone born to command. The governor looks down at her, literally, because there's no chair waiting for her. Just a woven mat on the floor. It's a deliberate insult, a power move. Sit on the floor like a servant. Know your place. But Nzinga doesn't flinch. She gestures calmly to one of her attendants, a woman in her entourage. Without hesitation, the woman drops to her hands and knees, and Nzinga sits on her back, using her own attendant as a living throne. The room freezes. Portuguese guards stand paralyzed. The governor's mouth falls open. Nzinga meets his eyes, calm, steady, unbothered. The message is crystal clear. I will not bow. I am royalty, and I sit where I choose. The negotiations begin, and Nzinga dominates. She speaks perfect Portuguese. She knows their laws, their trade agreements, their weaknesses. She negotiates a peace treaty, forces the release of prisoners, gets Portugal to recognize Ndongo as a sovereign nation. When she leaves, the Portuguese are still processing what just happened. They've been outplayed, outnegotiated, humiliated by a woman they thought they could intimidate. Big mistake. Nzinga returns to Ndongo a hero. The people celebrate, but her brother seethes with jealousy and rage. And then in 1624, Mbandi dies suddenly. The official story is illness, but rumors swirl. Poison, assassination, revenge. No one knows for sure, but one thing is certain. Nzinga becomes queen. Except there's a problem. In Ndongo, tradition says women can't lead armies, women can't declare war, women can't command as warriors. So Nzinga does something radical. She declares herself king, not queen. King. She wears men's clothing. She takes the title Nungola. She surrounds herself with male warriors and leads from the front. When people question her, she makes it clear. I'm not pretending. I am a king, and I will lead this nation to victory. The Portuguese laugh. They think it's theater. A woman playing dress-up. They're about to learn the most painful lesson of their lives. Nzinga's war against Portugal begins with a strategy the world has never seen. No big battles, no open fields, no standing armies waiting to be slaughtered by cannons. Guerrilla warfare, centuries before anyone gave it that name. The Portuguese are used to European-style combat, formations, gunpowder volleys, cavalry charges, but Nzinga fights in the jungle, in the mountains, in the rivers and swamps. Her warriors know every trail, every hiding spot, every ambush point. The Portuguese march confidently into the interior, hundreds of soldiers, guns, cannons, ready to crush this upstart queen. And then the attacks begin. Arrows from the trees, spears from the tall grass, midnight raids, supply convoys ambushed, messengers disappear. The Portuguese can't find her army, can't predict where she'll strike, can't catch her. Every time they think they've cornered her, she's already gone. It's psychological warfare, and it's destroying them. Portuguese soldiers are exhausted, paranoid, terrified. They're fighting an enemy they can't see, a commander they can't outsmart. And Nzinga is just getting started. In 1626, Portugal launches a massive offensive. They bring everything: cannons, hundreds of reinforcements. African allies bribed or forced into fighting for them. They march on Ndongo's capital, and this time they win. The capital falls. Nzinga is forced to retreat. The Portuguese celebrate. They think it's over, but Nzinga doesn't surrender. doesn't beg, doesn't hide. Instead, she does something brilliant. She marches east to the kingdom of Matamba, a neighboring nation that's been neutral, and she takes it over, not through brutal conquest, through strategy. She arrives with her army and offers the people of Matamba something they desperately need: protection, leadership, a chance to resist the Portuguese together. They accept her. Overnight, Nzinga has a new kingdom, a new army, a new base of operations. The Portuguese are stunned. They thought they'd defeated her. But she's just relocated and reorganized, and now she's stronger than ever. For the next 20 years, Nzinga turns Matamba into a fortress, a sanctuary. Escaped slaves, welcome. Refugees fleeing Portuguese violence, come in. Warriors looking for revenge, join the army. She builds a coalition: Ndongo fighters, Matamba warriors, Imbangala mercenaries, Jaga soldiers, even Portuguese deserters who've had enough of empire. She creates a multi-ethnic resistance state, and she trains everyone in guerrilla warfare. The Portuguese call her a terrorist, a savage, a threat to civilization. But in Matamba, she's a hero, a liberator, a queen who refuses to bow. In 1641, something changes everything. The Dutch arrive. The Dutch West India Company is at war with Portugal. They want control of the African coast, the slave forts, the trade routes, and they need allies. Nzinga sees opportunity. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. She makes a deal. The Dutch provide guns, cannons, and ships. In return, Nzinga fights Portugal on land. It's a perfect alliance. For the next 7 years, Nzinga and the Dutch wage a devastating campaign. They capture Portuguese forts, disrupt supply lines, free thousands of enslaved people. Portugal is losing badly, but in 1648, disaster strikes. The Dutch and Portuguese sign a peace treaty in Europe. The Dutch abandon Nzinga, leave her to fight alone. Portugal launches another all-out assault. They think they finally have her. But Nzinga doesn't break. She regroups, adapts, and keeps fighting. By 1656, Nzinga is in her 60s. Most people that age are frail, retired, sitting by the fire, telling stories. Not Nzinga. She's still leading armies, still riding into battle, still commanding from the front lines. Portuguese soldiers tell stories about her. They say she fights like a demon, that bullets bounce off her, that she's cursed their armies with witchcraft. The truth is simpler. She's just better at war than they are. After decades of trying, the Portuguese finally realize something. They can't beat her, can't outlast her, can't break her will, so they do the only thing left. They offer peace. In 1656, Portugal and Matamba sign a treaty. Matamba is recognized as independent. Nzinga is acknowledged as its sovereign ruler. After 40 years of war, Nzinga has won. Not through surrender, not through compromise, through sheer, relentless, unbreakable will. Nzinga rules Matamba for another 7 years. She focuses on rebuilding, trade, diplomacy, education. She even converts back to Christianity. Not because Portugal demands it, but because it gives her political leverage in European circles. She builds churches, invites missionaries, plays the game of international politics better than the Europeans themselves. And in 1663, at the age of 81, Queen Nzinga dies peacefully. She never lost a battle she personally commanded, never surrendered, never bowed, and she left a legacy that would echo for centuries. But here's the tragedy. After her death, the Portuguese return. They wage new wars. They eventually conquer Matamba, enslave its people, And when European historians write about Africa, they leave Nzinga out. They call her a rebel, a footnote, a savage. They erase her victories, ignore her genius, pretend she never existed. Why? Because admitting the truth would destroy their narrative. If an African woman could outsmart and defeat European armies for 40 years, then Africans weren't inferior. Africa wasn't defenseless. Colonization wasn't inevitable. So they buried her story. For centuries, Nzinga was forgotten outside Angola. But inside Angola, the memory survived. Oral historians kept her story alive. Griots passed it down. Mothers told their daughters. Warriors honored her name. And in the 20th century, when Angola fought for independence from Portugal, Nzinga became a symbol, a rallying cry, because her story proved what colonizers never wanted anyone to know. Africa fought back, and sometimes Africa won. Today, Queen Nzinga is remembered as one of the greatest military leaders in African history. Statues stand in her honor. Schools carry her name. Her face appears on currency. But more than monuments, her story endures because it teaches something powerful. Strength isn't about size. It's not about resources or technology or who has the biggest guns. Strength is about will, strategy, and refusing to accept defeat. Nzinga was 60 years old when she fought some of her greatest battles, an age when the world expected her to be weak, irrelevant, finished. But she proved them all wrong. She fought until her last breath, and she won. Not because she was lucky, not because she had help, but because she was smarter, tougher, and more determined than anyone who tried to stop her. Queen Nzinga didn't just survive. She conquered, she led, she inspired. And 700 years later, we're still talking about her. Because some people, no matter how hard you try, cannot be erased. But wait, there's more to this story, a part they buried even deeper. Because Queen Nzinga wasn't just a warrior. She was a master of diplomacy, a builder of alliances, a woman who understood that real power doesn't come from winning battles. It comes from changing the game entirely. Let's go back to 1641, the moment the Dutch arrived. Most people think this was just a military alliance, guns for soldiers, ships for raids. But Nzinga saw something bigger. She saw an opportunity to completely reshape the power structure of West Africa. See, the Portuguese controlled the slave trade. They had the forts, the ships, the connections to the Americas, and as long as they had that monopoly, they could buy African kingdoms, turn them against each other, keep everyone weak and divided. But if Nzinga could break that monopoly, if she could give African kingdoms another option, another trading partner, then everything changed. So when she made her deal with the Dutch, it wasn't just about fighting Portugal. It was about creating an alternative economy, one where African kingdoms could trade directly with Europe without going through Portuguese slave merchants. She negotiated trade agreements, direct exchange of goods, African ivory, copper, and textiles for European weapons and tools. No slaves required, and for a few years it worked. Matamba became a trading hub. Other kingdoms saw what Nzinga was doing and wanted in. The Portuguese monopoly started to crack, but then the Dutch betrayed her. And here's why that betrayal mattered so much. It wasn't just about being abandoned in a war. It was about watching her economic revolution die. When the Dutch signed their treaty with Portugal, they agreed to stay out of the slave trade in certain regions, which meant they abandoned the alternative economy Nzinga had been building. and African kingdoms went right back to the Portuguese. Because they had no choice, it was trade with the slavers or have no trade at all. Nzinga watched this happen, watched her vision of an independent African economy collapse, and she made a decision. If she couldn't change the system from the outside, she'd survive it from the inside. This is where Nzinga's story gets complicated, and this is the part historians argue about. Because after the Dutch left, Nzinga did something that seems to contradict everything we know about her. She started participating in the slave trade, not with the Portuguese, never with the Portuguese, but with other African kingdoms, capturing prisoners of war, trading them for weapons and supplies. Some historians say this proves she was just another brutal ruler, that all her talk of resistance was hollow. But others say she was doing what she had to do to survive, that in a world where every kingdom participated in the slave trade, refusing to do so meant extinction. And there's evidence for this, because Nzinga never sold her own people, never raided Matamba villages. She only traded prisoners captured in battles against kingdoms allied with Portugal. It was strategic, brutal, morally complicated, but it kept Matamba alive. And here's the thing about judging historical figures. We have to understand the world they lived in, the impossible choices they faced. Nzinga wasn't fighting in a world where she could choose between good options. She was fighting in a world where every choice was terrible, and she picked the ones that kept her people free. Let's talk about something else they don't teach you, Nzinga's personal life, because for all the stories about her as a warrior and a king, we rarely hear about her as a woman. She never married, at least not in the traditional sense. Some accounts say she kept a harem of men dressed as women, that she took lovers and discarded them. The Portuguese used these stories to paint her as immoral, savage, unchristian. But modern historians think something else was going on. Nzinga was rejecting the role of wife, because being a wife in the 17th century meant being subordinate, being property, and Nzinga refused to be anyone's property. So she inverted the power dynamic entirely. She took male lovers on her terms, and she made sure everyone knew she was in control. It was another form of resistance. Against Portuguese colonization, yes, but also against the patriarchy that said women couldn't rule, couldn't fight, couldn't control their own bodies and lives. Nzinga said no to all of it, and she lived exactly how she wanted. Now let's talk about her conversion to Christianity, because this is another part of her story that gets misunderstood. Nzinga was baptized as a young woman during those negotiations in 1622, took the name Ana de Sousa, after the Portuguese governor. Then, when she became queen and started fighting Portugal, she renounced Christianity, went back to traditional Ndongo beliefs. The Portuguese called her a heretic, an apostate, proof that Africans couldn't be trusted to stay Christian. But in 1656, after the peace treaty, Nzinga converted again, built churches, funded missions, became a model Christian queen. So what was she really? Christian or traditional? Believer or political operator? The answer is probably both, and neither. Nzinga understood that religion was power. In 17th century Africa, being Christian gave you access to European diplomatic circles. It made treaties more legitimate. It brought missionaries who could teach reading and writing. So she used Christianity when it served her purposes, and abandoned it when it didn't. Some people call this cynical, but Nzinga would probably call it smart. She played the game. She used every tool available, and she never let religion or anything else control her. Here's something most people don't know. In her final years, Nzinga wrote letters to the Pope, to the King of Portugal, to other African rulers. These letters still exist, and they're remarkable. In them, Nzinga doesn't write as a defeated enemy begging for mercy. She writes as an equal, a fellow monarch, a ruler negotiating with other rulers. She discusses theology, trade agreements, diplomatic recognition. She asks the Pope to send more educated priests to Matamba, not to convert people, but to teach. She tells the King of Portugal that Matamba is willing to trade, but only as equals, that the days of Portugal dictating terms are over, and she writes to other African kingdoms, warning them about Portuguese expansion, offering alliances, sharing strategies. She was building something, even in her 70s and 80s, still working, still planning, still fighting in her own way. Because Nzinga understood something profound. Wars aren't just won on battlefields, they're won in negotiations, in alliances, in the stories people tell about you. And she was very, very good at controlling her own story. Let's talk about what happened after she died, because this is where the real tragedy begins. Nzinga's sister, Barbara, took the throne, and for a while Matamba survived. The peace held, the kingdom thrived. But within a generation, cracks appeared. Matamba's neighbors, jealous of its power, started pushing back. Internal disputes over succession weakened the central government, and the Portuguese, patient as ever, waited for their moment. In the early 1700s, they invaded again. This time there was no Nzinga to stop them. Matamba fell. Its people were enslaved, its cities burned, its history erased. And the Portuguese told a new story. That Matamba had always been a savage place, that Nzinga had been a tyrant, that Portuguese rule brought civilization. They destroyed her statues, burned her letters, tried to erase her from history, but they failed. Because stories don't die as long as someone remembers them. In the 1960s and 70s, when Angola fought for independence, Nzinga became a symbol again. Freedom fighters invoked her name. Her image appeared on posters. Her story inspired a generation of revolutionaries, because her message was timeless. Resistance is possible. Victory is possible, even against impossible odds. And in 1975, when Angola finally won its independence, one of the first things the new government did was commission a statue of Queen Nzinga. It stands in Luanda today, in the same city where she sat on that living throne 350 years ago. She's depicted in full armor, sword raised, defiant, and tourists from around the world come to see it, to take pictures, to hear her story, because Queen Nzinga isn't just Angolan history. She's world history, human history. She won the long game, the game of memory, the game of legacy. 700 years later, we remember her name, we tell her story, we honor her resistance, and that's the greatest victory of all.